The boy called out in a hall containing 400 people, and not one of them moved. That was the whole of my case. I had no document, and no witness, and nothing to accuse anybody of that was not written down and lawful, and so I had asked the council of Vardome for one thing only, which was to sit in a room with a 3-year-old for as long as it took. He called twice. The 2 notes any child makes, the second higher than the first, the sound a pup makes when it wants to know where somebody is. 400 people. Half of them lords who had been raised in that keep. And every single one of them sat there with their hands in their laps and did absolutely nothing, because they had been taught not to, 40 years ago, when they were 3. In the 3rd row, a man of about 60 put his face in his hands. 11 weeks earlier, I had been on my knees scrubbing a floor in the east corridor when I heard a child calling through a wall. And I answered him, because where I come from that is not a decision. My name is Hildy, and I scrubbed floors at Vardome Keep. I was 24 that spring. No house behind my name, my mother dead of a winter fever when I was 15, and I came down out of Ambry, a village of 200 people up on the Western Fells, the way most of us come down, which is because there is work in a keep, and there is not much work in Ambry. Floor scrubbing is the bottom of a great house. You start before the household wakes, and you are meant to be finished and gone before it moves about, and a woman on her knees with a brush is furniture. In 11 months at Vardome, not one ranked person had ever spoken to me. I do not say that bitterly. It is simply the arrangement, and I knew the arrangement when I took the post. I want to tell you one thing about Ambry before anything else happens, because everything I did in that keep came out of it, and I did not know it was unusual until I was told. In Ambry, you answer. That is all. If somebody calls, you call back. Across a field, up a stair, through a wall, you do not necessarily go. You may be elbow deep in something, but you answer. Because a call is a question, and the question is where are you, and the answer costs you nothing. Children learn it before they learn their letters. My mother used to say that the only genuinely wicked thing a person can do to another person is hear them and say nothing back. I thought this was how everyone lived. I want that understood. I had 24 years of assuming it, and I was wrong, and finding out I was wrong cost me the best year of my life. The Prince Emil was 3 years old and had been crying since about the 7th hour of the morning. I knew because the whole East Wing knew. You could hear it in the corridors, not loud, not screaming, just the steady, exhausted sound of a very small child who has been at it for a long time, and by the middle of the afternoon, the keep had the particular atmosphere of a household in a slow panic. I had been on that floor since dawn, and I had watched them go in and out all day. 2 nurses. Then 4. Then the physician. Then the physician again, with another physician. Then a great many ranked people whose names I did not know, and at about the 4th hour, the king's own sister, and after her a woman in grey who everyone stood aside for, and who was in there a long time, and came out with her face like a shut door. And it did not stop. 9 hours. I was working the corner of the east corridor at about the 5th hour, on my knees, with the nursery on the other side of that wall, when he did it. Not a wail. He had been wailing all day, and I had scrubbed through it the way you scrub through weather. This was different. 2 notes. The second one higher, thin and small and asking, and then a pause, and then the same 2 notes again. He was not crying at that point. He was calling. I did not think about it. I want to be entirely honest. There was no decision anywhere in it. There was no moment where I weighed the propriety of a floor scrubber addressing the air of Vardome through a wall. My body simply did what a body from Ambry does, which was to sit back on my heels and give him the 2 notes back, second one lower. The way you answer. The crying stopped. Not gradually. between one breath and the next, on the other side of that wall, 9 hours of it simply ceased, and there was a silence so complete that I heard my own brush drip. And then he called again. Twice, quickly, high and urgent, "Are you still there?" And I answered again. And he made a sound I have never been able to describe to anybody, and which I would like to hear once more before I die. And then he was quiet. I went back to my floor. I did not go in. I want that plain, because the story people tell has me sweeping into that nursery like a physician. And I did nothing of the kind. I was a floor scrubber 24 years old, with a brush in my hand, and no more right to open that door than to sit on the throne. And so I stayed on my knees in the corridor, and I answered him every time he asked for about a quarter of an hour, until he stopped asking and went to sleep. Then I finished the corner, and moved down the corridor, and got on with my work, and I did not tell a single soul, because I had not the faintest notion that anything had happened at all. I found out something had happened when I turned round about an hour later, and there was a man standing in the corridor watching me. He had been there a while. That was the thing I registered first, not who he was, but that he had been standing in that corridor for some considerable time, without saying anything, and had not moved when I turned, and did not move now. He was enormous, and grey about the eyes with tiredness, and standing in the doorway of the nursery with one hand on the frame in a way I did not understand for another 6 weeks. "You answered him," said King Leaf of Vardome. I got up too fast and said a great many things at once, all of them apologies, and he raised one hand about 4 inches and I stopped. "You are not in trouble." His voice had something in it I could not read. "I have been standing here since the 5th hour. I watched you do it. I want to know what you did." I answered him, "Your Grace." "Yes, what is that?" And I looked at the King of Vardome and understood, with the first cold touch of something I did not have a name for, that he was not asking me to explain a technique. He was asking me what the thing was. I want to describe the next 6 weeks carefully, because it was the strangest and best time of my life, and because the shape of it is the whole story. They did not promote me. Dame Hollis, the woman in grey, the mistress of the prince's rearing, established within about 2 days that a floor scrubber could not be given any office in the household of the heir. And she was correct, and there was a great deal of very quiet arranging, and what came out of it was this. I kept my post, and my brush, and my hours were changed, so that I worked the east corridor. Every day, outside that wall, on my knees with a brush, answering a 3-year-old through 11 inches of stone whenever he asked where I was. It is the most ridiculous arrangement I have ever heard of, and it worked immediately and completely. Emil stopped the long crying inside a week. He slept. He ate. The physicians were baffled and delighted, and wrote a great deal of nonsense about the calming effect of routine. And Dame Hollis let them, and I scrubbed a corridor and called back through a wall and was, for about a month, happier than I have ever been. I saw him in the 2nd week. Actually saw him. The nurse Anki brought him out into the corridor, quickly, without asking anybody, and he came round the doorframe and stopped dead, and stared at me on my knees with a brush in my hand. And then he sat down on the floor about 4 feet away, facing me, and made the 2 notes. I answered him. He looked enormously satisfied, the way only a very small person can, and then he stayed there for an hour while I worked, and every so often he asked, and I answered, and neither of us did anything else at all. The king came to the corridor most days after that. He never came all the way in. That is what I noticed, and did not understand he would come to the doorway of the nursery, or the head of the east corridor, and stand and talk to me while I worked, and never once cross into the room where his son was. He talked to me the way people talk, when they have not talked to anybody in a very long time. Not about state business, about Emil, whether he had eaten, whether he had asked for anything, what he had done with the wooden horse. A father hungry for the ordinary daily report of his own child, delivered by the floor scrubber, in a corridor, because the floor scrubber had been closer to him all day than he had. "You could go in and see for yourself," I said once, in about the 4th week being an idiot. And King Leaf of Vardome looked at the doorway of his son's nursery 4 feet away and did not answer me at all. I decided he was ashamed of something. That is what I settled on, in my own head, over about a fortnight, and I was so nearly right that I have never quite forgiven myself for how wrong I was. I thought he was a man who had let his household run his child, the way great men do, and had woken up to it late and could not bear to be seen arriving. I thought the doorway was pride, so I did what you do with a proud man, which is not to mention it, and I went on giving him the daily report in the corridor and never once said "come in again," and I was extremely proud of my own tact. He talked more as the weeks went. That was the thing that ought to have told me and did not. He told me his wife had died when Emil was 11 months old, of a fever that took 9 people in that keep that winter, and which he still could not discuss in a level voice. He told me that he had been at the border when it happened, and had got home in 4 days, and that 4 days is a long time. He asked me, once, whether I thought a child of 3 remembered anything at all, and I said I thought a child of 3 remembered how a room feels, and he was quiet for so long after that I thought I had wounded him, and he asked about Ambry. Constantly he wanted the whole of it, the fells, the 200 people, the winter, my mother, what the village did when somebody's roof went. I told him about a night when I was 9 and old Serret's byre came down in a storm, and how you could hear people calling up and down that valley in the dark for 2 hours. Everybody answering everybody, half of them not even going anywhere, just calling so the rest knew the shape of who was still out there. He made me tell that one 3 times. Nobody was in charge of it, he said, the 3rd time. Not a question. Nobody's in charge of anything in Ambry, Your Grace. It's 200 people and a lot of weather. And they all did it. They all did it. You do it before you've thought about it. That's the entire. And I stopped, because a king was looking at a wall with an expression I did not understand, and because it had finally occurred to me, 4 weeks in, that a man does not ask a floor scrubber to describe the same night 3 times, unless he is trying to imagine his way into something. Emil came out to the corridor most days by then. Anki had stopped pretending it was accidental. He had worked out that the sound came from a particular place, and that the place had a woman in it, and he would come round that doorframe at a determined waddle and sit down 4 feet from my bucket and conduct his entire afternoon there. He did not want anything from me. That is what I have never been able to make people understand about those weeks. He did not want to be held or played with or entertained. He wanted to be somewhere that somebody would answer, and he would sit on a cold floor for 2 hours to have it, and every 20 minutes or so he would check. 2 notes, and I would answer, and he would go back to the wooden horse entirely satisfied. A 3-year-old spent 11 weeks of his life sitting on a stone floor in a draught to be near a bucket, and the whole household called it a charming eccentricity of the air, and not one person in that keep asked what he was actually doing, including me. That is the part I have to say plainly. I was on the floor with him every day for 11 weeks, answering him, and I never once asked myself why a child in a palace full of people who loved him had to come and sit by a scrubbing woman to get an answer out of anybody. I thought I was being kind. I was being kind. It never crossed my mind that I was being the only one. I did not know yet why a grown man who could break a door off its hinges had been standing in that one for 6 weeks without going through it. If you want to find out what is written in a household's rearing book, and why 400 people in a hall sat still while a child called out to them, Stay with me. What Anki told me in the 7th week is the reason I am telling any of this at all. Anki told me because she could not carry it anymore. That is the whole of the reason, and I have never once held it against her that it took 7 weeks. She was one of the nursery nurses, the youngest, about my age, and she had been weeping in the linen room, and I found her there because I was collecting rags. And she looked up at me with the face of a woman who has decided. "You know we're not permitted," she said. I did not know what she meant. I thought she meant the corridor arrangement. I thought she was frightened of Dame Hollis. I said something soothing and stupid. Not the corridor. Answering him. She was gripping the linen. We are not permitted to answer him. It is written down. It is in the book. She took me to the book. It is called The Rearing of the Heir, and it has been the practice of the House of Vardome for 4 generations, and it is not secret at all. It sits in the household library, bound with the king's own seal on the first page from his grandfather's time. I could read it well enough. My mother taught me letters, and Ambry is proud of that. The doctrine is this: an alpha king's authority rests on his sufficiency, on the whole territory's understanding that he does not need anyone. A child who learns that his distress summons others learns dependence, and a dependent alpha is a weak one, and weakness in that seat costs lives. Therefore the heir is reared to sufficiency. He is kept warm, fed, clean, safe, taught, and not answered. His needs are met before he asks. His asking is never rewarded. In particular, and this is the clause, written out in a fine clerk's hand 2 generations before I was born, the heir's call shall not be returned. Not once. Not ever. It is the first thing the nurses are instructed in, and the last thing they are examined on. Something in me went very still and very clear. 9 hours of a 3-year-old calling into a room full of trained, competent, decent women who had been examined on their willingness to say nothing back. That is why nobody could reach him. Not incompetence, not cruelty, not a mystery ailment. 4 physicians and 11 nurses and a king's own sister had failed to comfort a child for 9 hours, because comforting him was the one thing every single person in that room had been formally forbidden to do, and the only person in Vardome who did it was a woman on the wrong side of a wall who had never read the book. And then the second thing arrived, and it was worse. I turned the pages back. The book had a record in it, every heir reared under it, 4 generations, with the dates. And there, 41 years ago, in the same clerk's hand, Leif, son of Vardome, entered to rearing at 11 months. I stood in that library with the book open and understood why a man who could break a door off its hinges had spent 6 weeks standing in one. He had been that child. Every night of the last 6 weeks he had come to that doorway and stood on the threshold of his son's nursery and been unable to make his own feet carry him across it, because at 11 months old he had been given, deliberately, over years, by kind and competent people following written instructions, the absolute certainty that answering a call is the thing you do not do. He was not aloof. He was not a cold man, and he was not a bad father. He had been reared not to be able to, and he had known it was wrong for 6 weeks, and had not once had the language for it, and he had been standing in that doorway every single night, trying. I did not go to Dame Hollis, and I did not go to the council. I went to the king, that night in the corridor, and I told him what I had read, and then I asked him one question. "Do you remember it?" He was quiet for a long moment. "I remember calling," said the king of Vardome. "I do not remember stopping. I have never in my life been able to work out at what age I stopped. And I have thought about it more since Emil was born than in the whole of the rest of my life, and I could not tell you whether I was 3 or 5 or 7. His hand was on the door frame. I remember that it did not work. That is all that is left of it, a very clear understanding that it does not work, which I acquired before I could form a sentence, and which I have never once been able to argue myself out of. I know what is on the other side of this door. I know he is 3. I stand here and I cannot do it. I did not say anything, because there was nothing to say that was not smaller than that. Hildy, he did not look at me. You are the only person in 4 generations of this house who has ever said the 2 notes back to a Vardome child, and I would like you to understand that I watched you do it from this doorway, and I did not know what I was watching until my son stopped crying. Dame Hollis moved in the 9th week, and she moved properly, and I want to be fair to her, because being fair to her is the only way this story means anything. She was not a monster. She was 61 years old, and she had administered the rearing for 30 years, and she believed in it entirely. She had been reared under a version of it herself, and she had reared 2 kings, and she could tell you the name of every alpha in 4 generations who had held that seat without breaking, and she genuinely believed that the alternative was a weak king and a bled territory and children dying in border wars that a stronger man would have prevented. She did not have me arrested. She had me removed, which is worse and considerably harder to fight. She wrote to the Chamberlain, observing that an undermaid of the East Corridor had formed an irregular attachment to the person of the heir, that the arrangement had never been formally sanctioned, that it was already the subject of comment in the household, and that in the interest of the boy's stability, the arrangement should be ended and the woman reassigned to the West Range. Every word of it was true. That is the thing I have had to sit with. It was irregular. It never had been sanctioned. It absolutely was the subject of comment. I was moved to the West Range on a Thursday. Emil started the long crying again on the Friday. And then she did the second thing, which nearly finished all of us. She petitioned for the prince to be sent to the rearing house at Ostwood. There is such a place. There has always been such a place. The establishment where the doctrine is administered in full, away from the sentiment of a household, and where 2 of the last 4 heirs were reared entirely, and it exists for exactly this circumstance, a household in which the rearing has been disrupted. She had the precedent, she had the record, and she had the authority, because the mistress of the rearing holds the heir's upbringing by 4 generations of custom, and a king does not overrule it, because no king ever has, because every king was reared not to. Leaf could not stop it. He tried. He went at it for 11 days, and the answer was always the same, from men who were not his enemies and were genuinely trying to help him. It is the custom, your grace. It has raised 4 kings, and your own objection is precisely the sort of sentiment the rearing exists to set aside. He came and found me in the West Range on the 11th night, which I do not think a king of Vardome has ever done, and he said, "I have run out." "They take him on Monday." "Then stop asking them," I said. "I have asked everybody. You have asked men who were reared under it." I put down the brush. Every single one of them, your grace. The whole council, every lord in that hall, was 3 years old in this territory once, and every one of them was taught the same thing. And you are asking a room of men to overturn the thing that was done to them, in words, in an afternoon. They cannot hear you. They have all got the same clear understanding you have, and they got it before they could form a sentence. I looked at him. You cannot argue it. Nobody can argue it. I want you to give me 1 hour with them and a chair for the boy. I asked for the hearing, and I was granted it because Leaf spent his entire remaining authority on getting a floor scrubber 10 minutes of a council's time, and because Dame Hollis did not object. She did not object because she was not afraid of me, and I want to say clearly that she was right not to be. I had no document, no witness, and no accusation. Everything she had done was written down, 4 generations old, sealed by a king, and lawful. She agreed to the hearing because she believed the council would watch a maid make a scene and be confirmed in everything she had ever thought. I had Emil brought in and sat on a chair at the front, with Ank beside him. And I asked the council of Vardome for one thing, which was silence. Then I went and stood at the back of the hall, 40 feet away from him, where he could not see me, and I waited. It took about a minute and a half. He called. The 2 notes, the second higher, thin and small, into a hall containing 400 people. And not one of them moved. I want you to understand that they were not being cruel. That is what I had come to show them, and it is the only thing worth taking from this account. Those were not wicked men. There were fathers in that room. There were men who would have gone into a river for that child, and a 3-year-old called out in front of all of them, and 400 people sat with their hands in their laps and did nothing at all. Because 40 years ago, somebody had taught them, thoroughly and kindly and on purpose, that this is the one thing you do not do. He called again. Nothing. And again. And by the 4th time, the sound had changed into the one I had heard through a wall in the east corridor, and there was a noise in that hall that was 400 people not being able to stand it, and not knowing they were permitted to move. In the 3rd row, a man of about 60 put his face in his hands, and could not take it away again. I let it run 20 seconds more than I could bear, which is the part I have to carry, and then I said, "From the back of that hall, Emil." And I gave him the 2 notes back. The whole thing was over in about 4 seconds. He turned round in the chair and found me and went absolutely quiet and made that sound I still cannot describe, and sat back down, and was entirely fine, and picked up the wooden horse Anki had brought. I did not have to say anything else. There was nothing to say. 400 people had just watched a 9-hour problem and its 4-second solution, in order, in front of them, and every man in that hall who had been 3 years old in Vardome was doing his own arithmetic, and I did not need to do it for him. Then the king of Vardome stood up. He came down off the dais, and he crossed 40 feet of open floor in front of the entire council, and he got about 8 feet from the chair and stopped, and I watched a man fight the whole of his own upbringing standing still in a public hall, and it took him. Anki counted, afterward, because she could not help it. 19 seconds. Then he crouched down in front of his son and answered him himself. He got the notes slightly wrong. He had never done it before in his life. Emil did not care in the slightest. The rearing of the heir was struck out that season, and it was not clean, and it was not unanimous, and there are men in that territory who have still not forgiven it. It was replaced with 9 words that Leif wrote himself, and which are now read aloud at the installation of every nurse in Vardome. A child who calls in this house shall be answered. Dame Hollis was not disgraced. I insisted on that, and I would insist again. There was no crime. She administered a written, sealed, 4-generation doctrine exactly as she was appointed to. And she believed in it, and she was wrong. And being wrong for 30 years with a clear conscience is not a thing you can hang somebody for. She resigned the office, and she stayed at Vardome, and 11 months later she wrote me a letter. I will not reproduce it. What I will tell you is that it contained one sentence about a child she had reared 41 years ago, who used to call at night for the first fortnight, and that she had counted the nights, and that she had never told anybody the number until she wrote it down for me. Now the cost, because there was one and it was not mine to choose. They kept me from him for 4 months. That was the settlement, The council would strike the doctrine, and in exchange the household would establish a proper, formal, examined post for the care of the heir, and the appointment would be made on merit by a board. And until that board sat and reported, the irregular arrangement would not resume. It was reasonable. It was the price of doing it properly, instead of by a king's favour, and I agreed to it, and it was correct. Emil was 3. Nobody can explain 4 months to a 3-year-old. I had spent 11 weeks being the one person in that keep who always answered, and then I stopped, for 119 days, in order to win the argument that people should always answer, and for 119 days I was to him simply another person who had gone. Anki told me afterward that he asked for the first 6 weeks, then he stopped asking, and she wrote to me about that. And I sat down on the floor of the West Range and did not get up for some time. I got the post. The board sat and reported, and I was appointed. On merit, and I walked back into that nursery on a Tuesday in the spring, and a 3-year-old looked at me for a long moment with an expression I will be seeing when I die, and then made the 2 notes. He gave me a chance to answer. After 119 days. I answered him. Leaf asked me in the autumn, in the east corridor, at the place where the floor meets the wall, because he has a sense of occasion he pretends not to have. There is a thing I want to say first, he said. I have made certain the post is yours, regardless. It is a board appointment, and it cannot be undone by me, and it does not depend on your answering me tonight, or on your ever answering me at all. I did that in the spring, before I let myself think about the rest of it, because I was reared in this house, and I know exactly what it is to be a person with no way to refuse the man in the doorway. You've been practicing that. For 4 months, said the King of Vardome. It was considerably worse in the earlier versions. And then he asked me, and he did it badly, and I have never once wanted it done well. I kissed him first, in the east corridor, at the place where the floor meets the wall. It was brief, and it was warm, and it settled something in me that had been braced since I was 15, and my mother died, and I found out how quiet a house can get. 2 years on, Emil is 5, and he shouts, constantly, at everybody, in every corridor, in the hall, at ambassadors, and the whole of Vardome shouts back, because it is now the standing order of the household, and because a keep that has been trained out of silence overcorrects appallingly. Visiting lords find it deranged. There is a man from the Eastern Holdings who has twice had to be told that yes, he is expected to answer, and yes, out loud. I still work. Not the floors, I have the post, and 11 nurses under me, and I examine every one of them myself. The first thing I teach them is not a technique. It is the only thing I have ever known, that a call is a question, and the question is where are you, and answering it costs you nothing at all. Ank runs the East Wing, and has told me 4 times that she should have shown me the book in the 1st week instead of the 7th, and I have told her 4 times that she showed me at all, which nobody in 4 generations had done. Leif is still not good at it. 2 years, and he still gets the notes slightly wrong, and he still has a fraction of a second at every doorway that I can see and nobody else can. He crosses it every time now. It has never once become automatic, and I have stopped expecting it to. And the corridor is still there. The east corridor, where the floor meets the wall, I had it left exactly as it was, unrepaired, with the worn patch where I knelt for 11 weeks, and the household thinks it is sentiment. It is not sentiment. Emil is 5, and he will be king, and one day somebody will hand him a bound book with a seal on it and tell him it has raised 4 kings, and I want there to be a worn patch on a floor in his own house that he has to walk past on the way. I still wonder about the nurses, honestly, more than I wonder about Dame Hollis. She believed it and administered it, and there is at least a shape to that. But there were 11 women in that nursery, every one of whom loved that child. And they sat in a room for 9 hours listening to him call, and said nothing back. And not one of them was wicked, and not one of them stopped, because it was written down and sealed, and everybody had always done it. Tell me in the comments what you think you would have done in that room. Be honest with yourself about it. I have decided that I only did the right thing because I was on the wrong side of a wall and had never read the book, and that is not the same as being better than they were, and I have never once managed to persuade myself otherwise. Comment 2 notes if you want to hear what Leif's wolf did the first time Emil called for it across the Great Hall, and what it did to a state dinner. And if you want more nights like this one, a king who stood in a doorway for 6 weeks, a household that was trained not to answer, and a floor scrubber from a village where answering is just manners. Stay close. There is more of Vardome left to tell. Where are you listening from tonight? I would love to know.